Good evening, everyone. If we could ask you all to find your seats. But please feel free to warm up with some coffee or tea. We got to take advantage of it. I'm Brian Amkraut, the Executive Director of the Laura and Alvin Siegel Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University, and I want to thank you all for joining us this evening with Scott Cowen, who will be talking about the inevitable city. Before I introduce Dr. Cowen, I just want to say a couple of words about some upcoming programs here we have at the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program. Please check out our website for the latest activities and for any changes. That's cwru.edu/lifelonglearning. I just want to announce that next week we're having a free lecture here next Wednesday evening with Professor Daniel Goldmark from the music department, who will be talking about stereotyping American Jews, song, stage, and screen. That's 7 o'clock here in this building. And I want you all to consider saving the date of Sunday, April 19th. We're going to be having a Day at the University program at the Tincomville University Center, celebrating the life and legacy of Newton D. Baker with a number of faculty from the university and around town. We're really excited about that. And again, for all other information, please pay attention to our website. Tonight, we are pleased and privileged to welcome Scott S. Cowen, who is President Emeritus of Tulane University, served as Tulane's 14th president from July 1998 through June 2014. He has been named one of the top college presidents in the nation by Time, and Newsweek twice declared Tulane under his leadership one of the hottest schools in America. Dr. Cowen is the recipient of several national awards, including the Carnegie Corporation Academic Leadership Award and the TIAA-CREF Theodore M. Hesburgh Award for Leadership Excellence in Higher Education, as well as honorary degrees from the nation's top institutions, including the University of Notre Dame, Brown University, Yeshiva University, the University of Connecticut, and Case Western Reserve University, where he is now a member of the Board of Trustees. He has been a leader in New Orleans' recovery from Hurricane Katrina, which inflicted more than $650 million in damages to Tulane alone. He has been widely praised for helping to transform New Orleans' K-12 public schools and healthcare system after the storm. For these and other efforts, Dr. Cowen was awarded the Times-Picayune's Loving Cup. New Orleans City Business named him one of the 30 driving forces in New Orleans in the last 30 years, and he was named New Orleans of the Year by Gambit. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and was a member of the White House Council for Community Solutions, which advised President Barack Obama on the needs of disconnected youth. Dr. Cowen received his bachelor's degree from the University of Connecticut and his master's and doctorate in business administration from the George Washington University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cowen. After his lecture, there will be time for question and answer at the microphone down here. Following that, his book will be available for sale in the back. So please, a very warm round of applause for Scott Cowen.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out on this cold, snowy night in Cleveland, Ohio, and a reminder of why this time of year I like being in New Orleans, despite my love for Cleveland. I would say thank you for that very kind invitation. And whatever successes I've had in life, I attribute to two things. One is Case Western Reserve University, and the other is Cleveland. And even though my degrees are from other institutions, I really feel I got my education during my 23 years at the Case Western Reserve University. I came as a young assistant professor back in 1974, and had the good fortune of becoming an associate professor, a full professor, a chaired professor, and dean of the Weatherhead School of Management. And it was during those years while I was at Case Western Reserve University that I formed the friendships that have been lifelong friendships. I learned about community. I learned about community building. So I'm always proud to say, and I say it any place I go, that I owe an awful lot to Case Western Reserve and to Cleveland. And I was remarking to someone, you know you've taken a long journey when you start as an assistant professor and you wind up on the board of Case Western Reserve University. Thank you for having me here tonight to speak about the inevitable city. I want to answer three questions that are probably on your mind already, and then we'll talk about some major takeaways that I learned during my time during Katrina and at Tulane that may be relevant to Cleveland, a city that, as I said, I know well. The first question people always ask me is, where did we come up with the name the inevitable city? Well, Pierce Lewis is a geographer emeritus, if you will, at Penn State University. He once described New Orleans as the inevitable city on the impossible site. And that's why we called it the inevitable city. And it's unclear why it's inevitable. It was bound to be there because it's on the Mississippi River, and it was one of the great port cities. It was inevitable because of just how it came to be part of the United States close to 300 years ago. And it is on the impossible site because, for the most part, we live under seawater in New Orleans. But that's why I called the book what I did. The second question people ask me all the time is why did you write the book? What inspired you? Because this isn't your particular field of study, so why this book? And I say there are three reasons. The first one and the most important was it was unbelievably therapeutic for me. I can't adequately describe how traumatic and what an impact Katrina had on my life and on New Orleans and everybody who lived down there. To try to put it in perspective for you, is a week before Katrina made landfall in '05, our grandson was born. I didn't see him for the first time until 2 years later. And the reason was we worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 2 years just to survive as a university. Imagine, if you can, Cleveland, Ohio, being flooded for 57 days. And by the way, imagine it being flooded and it being 80% of the landmass of Cleveland, because that was what was flooded in New Orleans. 80% of the landmass was flooded. The population went from 460,000 to 10,000 in 2 weeks. We lost 250,000 jobs, and 50,000 homes were destroyed. It ultimately cost close to $200 billion to rebuild the city. And quite honestly, I didn't realize till 3 or 4 years later that I myself was suffering from post-traumatic stress. And it came to me one day when I realized that I could never read a book again. I could not open a book and finish it. I couldn't concentrate on anything for any period of time. And I had a sense of confusion and bewilderment for many years. And I went to someone to say, what's going on with me? And they said, well, you just went through a pretty horrendous experience. And I hadn't really thought about it. And people were asking me to speak about what happened during the Katrina. And every time I would try to write about it or speak about it, within 5 minutes, I would break out in tears. So I knew there was a time that I had to get it out of my system, and it took me, obviously, 8 years to get it to that point where I could write about it. When I wrote the book, I never thought, by the way, anyone would read it. It wasn't really meant to be for anybody else other than myself and a few colleagues at Tulane University. I never, ever envisioned it would wind up being as successful as it has been. I've been on book tour for 2 months in the fall to about every major city in the United States talking about the book. It seems to have resonated in urban areas because I think they all identify a bit of what happened in New Orleans with, by the grace of God, it could have happened to our city, or we're going through our own little crisis. It may not have been a hurricane. The second thing that cause of why I wrote the book was, I actually think the resurgence of New Orleans is a remarkable story. When I moved to New Orleans back in the late 1990s, I was there about 2 years, and I made a quick calculation. And the calculation was New Orleans had no desire to change. None. They loved who they were, and they didn't care that the school system was the 97th worst school system out of the 100 largest in the United States. They simply didn't care. They didn't care that they had more blight than just about any other city of its size in the United States. They didn't care that crime was rampant. They didn't care that the roads and the streets simply weren't functional. And that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but that was the reality. For example, if you looked at our school system prior to Katrina, we had 8 superintendents in 9 years. The school board was under investigation by the FBI. And in many of the schools, when you went into that school, there was no toilet paper, no paper and pencils, no books. And children were hopeless. I made the calculus that the last thing that New Orleans wanted was a Jewish guy from Jersey coming to New Orleans and telling them what to do. So I went about my business of just being president of Tulane University. But after Katrina, it changed dramatically. Because why? There weren't many people left. And those that left rolled up their sleeves and decided we're going to wind up having to rebuild this ourselves. And that's when I got very involved. I became a commissioner of the city back in 2005 for the notorious Ray Nagin, who is now in jail. I was one of 17 commissioners, and then I was subsequently tasked to head up the community-wide effort to build the new school system for New Orleans. That school system, I'm very proud to say, is a model for public school transformation in America today. And it's a remarkable story unto itself, even though it's still a work in progress. And then after that, I got involved in many, many other things because I saw an opportunity to serve, and it was an important time. When I look at New Orleans today, New Orleans is a stronger and better city than it's ever been. It's stronger and better than it was before Katrina. And it's stronger and better because of Katrina. Because if Katrina hadn't happened, the transformation that has occurred in New Orleans would never have occurred. And I can't stand and say we have cured all the problems, but quite honestly, we're working on all of them. At Tulane University, I would say the same thing. We're stronger and better today than we were before Katrina. We had to go through our own transformation. And quite honestly, we're doing better today than we would have ever done if Katrina hadn't happened. So it's a remarkable story in many ways of how a tragedy can turn into silver linings and lead to something very, very good. The third reason I wrote the book, besides a remarkable story, was it was meant to be a book about hope. After Katrina, and even to this day, I spend a lot of my time with the poorest of the poor people in New Orleans, in their neighborhoods. And I deal in particularly with one segment of that population, which is called disconnected youth. These are kids that are 16 to 24 years old, most of whom do not have a high school degree or a GED, none of whom have a job, many of whom have been incarcerated and are homeless. Oh, sorry about that. That must be one of them right now calling me. And I work with that population. I've worked with that population now for about 8 years. And what came to mind to me is that in America now, the zip code in which you live and were born probably determines what's going to happen in your life. And therefore, if some of us don't reach out to these kids in these poorest neighborhoods, what is to become of them? And if we don't do that, what's to become of our cities? So part of it was to provide hope to them about that there is a future for you if there's certain things you can do. That ultimately morphed into a large-scale program we have now at Tulane University, which is at an institute which happens to be named after me, called the Cowen Institute, where all we do is focus on youth success, both K through 12 and disconnected youth. And that book was for those kids and I spend a lot of time talking to them about it. That's why I wrote the book. Why did it take me so many years to write the book? One is, believe it or not, being a university president is a full-time job. You really don't have time for anything else. The second thing is I wanted to speak very frankly in the book about what I saw and what I learned. And I knew in the process I was going to offend a lot of people, starting with the President of the United States, and then work my way down the food chain. So I was strongly advised by our general counsel not to write the book when I was president. And so I almost got it right, because the book actually came out 2 weeks before I officially stepped out. Even to this day, my general counsel is still nervous that someone in Washington, D.C., especially from FEMA, is reading my book and hearing about what I said about FEMA, which was obviously not very, very kind. So I waited. The second reason I waited was I had to gather my stories together. I didn't know really what would happen to Tulane and New Orleans. And you don't know in a year or 2 years, and I figured we need some distance from this so you can look at it and see what's really happening. And after about 6 or 7 years, I realized we knew enough that the storyline was there. Now, I'll tell you just a little story about those moments after Katrina. It made landfall on August 29th, 2005. Matter of fact, we're coming up, believe it or not, on the 10th anniversary of Katrina this August. It's hard to believe. I was on campus. I decided to stay on campus knowing that the storm was going to come. There were about 30 of us who were on our uptown campus who stayed. And then we have a downtown campus which comprises our School of Medicine, our School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine, our hospital, and there were probably 200 people down there. When the storm came through, and I remember it was a Monday morning, it was horrific. I mean, it's hard to describe what the storm was like. But after the storm passed through, I walked out the building I was in, and there was no water anywhere. There were a couple tree limbs that were down, a couple shingles from some roofs, some windows broken. And I said, you know, we have dodged a bullet here. We have dodged a bullet. And I went to my home, which was about a block from campus, and I got some stuff, and I was about ready to leave the city, and I had heard that the levees had been breached. And I didn't quite know what that meant. I mean, I knew what the word breached meant, but I didn't know the implications of it. So I decided to stay another day. And within 24 hours after they were breached, 80%, by the way, of New Orleans was flooded. And that flooded water stayed for an average of 57 days. By the way, that landmass, in case you're wondering what's 80% of the landmass of New Orleans, is equivalent to 7 times the size of Manhattan. 7 times. There's only one part of New Orleans that wasn't flooded. It's called the Sliver on the River. And it's the only part of New Orleans that is above the sea level, and the original part of the city that was populated. But as more and more people came to New Orleans, and the poorer they were, they went to lower ground. So people in the lower 9th Ward or New Orleans East, they were completely flooded. When the floodwaters came, we lost all water, all power, all sewer, all communications, and it was August, which means it was 99 degrees outside, and the humidity was over 100. And for 6 days, in the location we were, we somehow found a way to survive. I eventually got out of New Orleans on the 6th day, and it was a combination. I took a boat. I got a golf cart, but I needed a battery, so I took a battery out of a car and put it in the golf cart. Took the golf cart. We found the dump truck that was abandoned but had the keys in it, so we took the dump truck. And then we drove to the Mississippi River and we hailed down a helicopter. And the helicopter ultimately took us to Patterson Air Base in Louisiana, and then later on to Texas. In the process, I siphoned some gas out of cars and did a few other things. About 2 weeks later, by the way, I was being interviewed on TV, as I think it was a Today Show, and someone was recounting my exodus from New Orleans. And they said, "We don't quite get this. You took a boat, you got a golf cart, and you admit that you had to get a battery for it. It's unclear where you got that battery. And then you took a dump truck, crashed through a fence, and hailed down a helicopter. We don't understand how a university president has these skills." And I said to him, you have to remember two things. I wasn't born a university president, but I was born and raised in New Jersey. And in New Jersey, you have skills that otherwise you don't have in other places, even Cleveland, Ohio. So that led me to Houston, Texas. And for 2 months, we set up a headquarters in Houston, Texas, and we had the whole senior team there. And it wasn't until November of '05 that we could move back to the city. The story of rebuilding Tulane is a story unto itself, and later on during the Q&A, I'll be glad to answer any questions about that. I will just simply say this, is every one of our campuses were destroyed, and we had no housing for people, we had no schools, there were no grocery stores, we had no hospital, we had nothing. And somehow in 6 months, we built a village, a self-contained village, so everybody could come back. Part of that village, by the way, given where we are, would be of interest to you. We had to house 2,000 people. We had no idea where to put them. So someone had a brainstorm one night, and they said, well, not too long ago, I was on a cruise. And I noticed that, there were a lot of berths in this cruise ship. Why don't we rent a cruise ship? Now, do you ever try in August to get a cruise ship within a week? So we put out some feelers, and we found a cruise ship that was in the Gulf of Mexico. By the way, this particular cruise ship was empty. It had no passengers, and it was an Israeli cruise ship. So I remember being on the Mississippi River watching this cruise ship coming down the Mississippi River, and it has, of course, the Star of David all over it. And I'm saying I said, what have we done here? I mean, this is unbelievable. So the ship comes up, it docks on the Mississippi River, I go on, nobody speaks English, it's only Hebrew. But, we were able to make it out. But the funniest part of that story was, I got a call later that day from a reporter in New Orleans. And they said, we understand that there's an Israeli ship that's coming down the Mississippi. And I said, that's true. And the reporter, I'm not making this, said, are the Israelis attacking New Orleans? And I said, the Israelis are very smart, and quite honestly, there's better fruit to be attacked than New Orleans. But those are the kinds of things we did, and later on, as I said, I'll be glad to describe them. As I reflect back on the last really 9.5 years now, there's 5 major takeaways from this experience, all of which I think are extremely relevant to Cleveland. Because having lived here for 23 years, you have to remember when I came to Cleveland in the 70s, Cleveland was the mistake on the lake, and we were an embarrassment. We were in the toilet, and somehow we got ourselves out of it, in the 80s and the 90s, and then quite honestly began to drift down again and are now coming out of it yet again. So I was used to this ebb and flow. So here are the 5 major takeaways. The first major takeaway is how do we set community priorities? Seems like a very simple one, but every urban area I know in America has unlimited needs and very limited resources. So how do you decide where to set the priorities? One of the tasks when I was a commissioner was we had to set the priorities for the community. And there were 7 that we set out. And I'm not going to mention all 7 of them, but I will mention the first 3. The first and most important priority for us was to rebuild the levee system or the flood protection system. Because our feeling was, by the way, if we didn't do that, why would anybody come back to New Orleans? Because another storm's going to occur. And by the way, we never refer to Katrina as a natural disaster. We always refer to it as a man-made disaster, because the responsibility for the levees and the flood protection system belongs to the Corps of Engineers, not to the city and not to the state. But for years, the Corps had ignored what we already knew, that that levee system was very weak, the barrier islands had been destroyed, and so had the wetlands. So there was no more protection anymore. When a hurricane came in, it used to hit the barrier islands, it would hit the wetlands. By the time it hit land, and the levees, it was weakened. That doesn't exist anymore. And that's another story unto itself about what environmentally has happened in the state of Louisiana and in the Gulf in that area. That was our number one priority. 9 years later, $15 billion of restoration to rebuild the levee system. And by the way, we have to spend another $90 billion in the next 50 years to really have the protection system we need. Some of you might have seen an article in the New York Times where in Louisiana, we lose the equivalent of a football field every hour to water. Every hour we lose the equivalent of a football field to water. You don't have to be a rocket scientist then to project how many years it will be before Louisiana really becomes just water. And the only way to do that is to rebuild the barrier islands and the wetlands, $90 billion. Who is to blame for that? I think it's pretty clear that the oil companies are to blame for it. And I could explain in great detail why that's the case. And where the funding will come remains to be seen. Some of it now will come from an act that was passed not too long ago, that a percentage of the revenue from the oil rigs that are out in the Gulf and so on, part of that revenue will now come to the state of Louisiana, where that was not the case before. The second priority we had was to rebuild our public education system. And that was a simple one. I already told you that we had one of the worst systems in America. And quite honestly, I've come to the belief that if you do not have a great public school system, you will never have a great city, period. I am so delighted we made that our second priority, because that is really what is transforming what's going on. The third priority for us was land use. We had to decide, what do you do with the lower Ninth Ward that got totally destroyed? Do you rebuild in the lower Ninth Ward or not? You can't imagine the controversy about land use and how we had to make those decisions. And it raised issues of racism, social engineering in New Orleans, that white people were trying to get rid of the black people or the poor people because they refused to rebuild in certain areas. But whatever the priorities are, the first thing is, do you have them in your community? Are they crystal clear? And is everybody taking the rare resources, their time and their dollars, and in fact, devoting them to those particular priorities? I can say in all honesty, that's going on in New Orleans right now. That's the first takeaway. Do we have the priorities? Are they really in the right order? And do we have the resources? Second major takeaway: never count on the political system or politicians to fix your city. The federal government failed us, the state government failed us, the city government failed us. Politicians come and go. They're not there forever. So the only way we can build our communities and our cities is if we do it ourselves. You roll up your sleeves and you do it individually and collectively and use what we call collective impact. I have become, if you will, a hawk on this. In every place I go, if you're thinking somehow some politician who's a mayor or a governor is going to fix something for you, it's not going to happen. And it's not going to be sustainable. So we got into this entire notion of empowerment and civic engagement. And that mantra, I would tell you what is the driving force in New Orleans is not the political system. They present more obstacles than they do solutions. But it's the civic engagement, private citizens like you and me making a difference every single year. This is a hard thing for people to grasp because they don't know how to get started. And we learned it in a time of crisis. Yet it's so, so key because we are the ones that make up our communities. And if we're not prepared to do it ourselves, one of the priorities we had on our list, by the way, was ethics reform in New Orleans. As you know, New Orleans, Louisiana is notorious for corruption, crime. By the way, I mean, Ohio's not a model either in these things, and Illinois is neither is New Jersey. But you know, we're best practices when it comes to these things. So we took on ethics reform. You know how there's been a dramatic change in ethics reform? It was done by a group of women called Citizens for One New Orleans. A group of women, wealthy, mostly white, uptown women who undertook ethics reform and has totally changed the culture in the city and the state by their actions. They've been written up in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, wherever it may be. It's a remarkable case story of empowerment. And there's other examples like that. I got so fixated by this notion of empowerment and civic engagement that we made a decision after Tulane to build that into the core curriculum for all undergraduates. Tulane University is the only major research university in the country, the only one that integrates public service into the core curriculum. All 4-year students are there. All 4 years. Last year, those students, and we have 6,400 undergraduates, logged in 750,000 hours of public service. And they get course credit for it. They also do it as part of volunteerism. It has totally transformed Tulane University. It has transformed who comes to the university. It has had a dramatic impact on retention rates, graduation rates, jobs that the students take when they graduate. Totally transformative. And we came to believe that at Tulane University, one of our largest tasks was to develop the next generation of engaged citizens and leaders of the world. And the best way to do that is, besides giving them the first-class education in the classroom, is to get them out of the classroom, put them in the field all 4 years, working in situations that make them uncomfortable and stretch them. Tulane University is primarily very bright students, mostly white, mostly rich. But these kids are working in every single neighborhood in New Orleans, and now they're around the world. So this notion of empowerment and civic engagement is so real. By the way, I learned that lesson right here in Cleveland. That's where I learned it. I learned it from people who constituted Cleveland Tomorrow back when it was originally formed. I saw what a group of people coming together could do when they want to change a city. So those basic lessons were learned right here. The only question is, how do we extend that? By the way, why is this so important to our students? You know, various studies have shown that about 50% of learning in college takes place in the classroom. The other 50% is outside the classroom. So the more we can organize the out-of-classroom experience, the better off we are. The second thing we learned is, quite honestly, just because you're A students doesn't mean you're going to be successful in life. Give me an A student who has very high emotional intelligence, and then I'll give you a winner. Matter of fact, give me a C student who has very high emotional intelligence, and I'm liable to find you a success in life. So what can we do as institutions to enhance emotional intelligence? So the second takeaway, empowerment, civic engagement, and it's all of our responsibilities. Third, what most cities are doing in the United States, and Cleveland is guilty of itself, or was guilty of it, it's not anymore. What they're doing is they're treating the symptoms, they're not treating the causes. I spoke in Detroit not too long ago. And the day I spoke in Detroit was the day they went out of bankruptcy, and they were euphoric because they had just come out of bankruptcy. And I spoke to a group of about 200 people. And I said, listen, I applaud you for coming out of bankruptcy. But if you think that is a measure of success, you're wrong. And matter of fact, if you're liable to get complacent because you're out of bankruptcy. You haven't even begun to rebuild this city. And then I went through the statistics for them about their public education system, their crime, their disconnection, and so on. I said, if you don't attend to those problems, you'll be back in the bankruptcy, if not financial, a different kind of bankruptcy. In essence, that's what happened to Cleveland back in the 80s and 90s. I know a lot of you were here. Think about it. We treated the symptoms. We built stadiums, we built hospitals, we did those other things. What did we actually do for public education? Not much. Not much. And what happens is you can improve a city for a decade and maybe 15 years, but the same problems are going to come all back again if that next generation is still poor, homeless, and jobless. I applaud Cleveland now. I actually think they get that. The issue with Cleveland, in my view, is they're not doing it at scale. They're doing it at the margin. And I'm not critical of it. It's the fact of life, because you have some obstacles here that you haven't been able to overcome yet to be able to do at scale. In New Orleans, that disaster created the environment to do it at scale. And to be very honest, as I said, as I headed the community, the first thing we did was to take all union contracts and just enforce force majeure and canceled all contracts. And we have absolutely nothing to do against unions, nothing at all. Matter of fact, as far as I'm concerned, the unions can come back. As long as their number one goal has to help kids be successful. That's their number one. If everything they do is aimed towards that, I'm all for it. If not, for a different model. So we put in a different model. Many cities still face those obstacles, and therefore they don't have the degrees of freedom that they might need. Yet I have to tell you, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, I was here, and I spent some time with a charter organization called Breakthrough Schools. Matter of fact, now the CEO of that is Alan Roskam, CWRU graduate, one of my former students, who was CEO of Joann Stores. And when Joann Stores was sold a number of years ago, he did this. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Breakthrough Schools. They now have 2,500 students. They're doing a remarkable job. And they're a great role model for Cleveland. And Cleveland is getting on the map, I can tell you, around the country with foundations and others, because they believe the city is serious. So what you're doing, you're going to a root cause, not just symptoms. But most cities are treating the symptoms and not causes, and the causes are poverty and lack of education and no jobs. The fourth takeaway is the notion of how do we, in fact, create the leadership to lead the transformation of our cities? What kind of leadership do you really need? And it really takes people with courage, with vision, with ability to execute. And you know, as I've looked at those people who are most successful in New Orleans, and quite honestly, having been sort of a student of leadership all my life, starting back at Case Western, you know, there's no surprises here. The people who I've seen be remarkably successful had 3 or 4 key traits. Unbelievably resilient, had that old word grit, a determination and a focus to succeed no matter what. Really were principled decision makers, so they made decisions based on a set of principles that guided what they did and how they did it. High emotional intelligence and integrity. And quite honestly, that leadership is needed more in our cities and in our organizations. And over the years, I've changed my whole way of interviewing people to really focus more on whether they have those attributes than anything else in the hiring process. We've got to identify those leaders early and nurture them, empower them to do things. And as I tell groups, we often mistake leadership because you say you can't be a leader unless you're president or a CEO or whatever. It's all wrong. There are 2 kinds of leadership. There's direct leadership and there's indirect leadership. Direct leadership is where you actually head up an organization, you have the title, and hopefully you're a leader. Doesn't necessarily mean you are, but hopefully you are. The more powerful form of leadership is indirect leadership, and that is leading by example. When you think of Mother Teresa, Bishop Tutu, Mandela before he became prime minister, or president, these were indirect leaders. They inspired us to do great things. And they didn't really lead anybody in terms of an organization. And we impound this in the brains, if you will, of our students is be indirect leaders. And then if that transforms into direct leadership, even so much. The last takeaway for me was the notion of the American dream. I grew up, I was born in the late 1940s. My youth was in the 50s and the 60s. And I grew up in a family that was, I guess, would be known as lower middle income or higher low income, depending on how you look at it. And my parents didn't go to college. My sister and I were the first generation of our family to go to college. But we were raised by our parents and our grandparents believing that whatever we dreamed about, we could probably achieve. It didn't make any difference that we didn't have much money and that we didn't live in a big house. It didn't. If you worked hard enough and you stayed focused, good things will happen to you. Young people, especially those in the lower socioeconomic, don't have that dream anymore. Matter of fact, they have just the opposite. They have the opposite. So how do we instill in these young people, again, this notion of the American dream? So the takeaway for me is the American dream is a big concept, but it's a local concept. Make it happen in our cities. Make it happen in Cleveland. Show people who live in Cleveland in the lowest socioeconomic classes or the zip codes that nobody wants to go to, that there's a pathway out, a pathway to an education, a pathway to a job. Show them they can do that. You show one, they're the example for others. Those are the 5 major takeaways from my story about Katrina. I've lived most of my life in 2 cities, New Orleans and Cleveland. And they have shaped my lives in different ways, and I love both of them. And I love Cleveland because I love the grittiness of Cleveland, I love its history, and I love what it's done for itself over the years. And even though my major residence is in New Orleans, I'm trying to find a way that I might be able to help some way in Cleveland. And I'm sure it's going to be in public education or disconnected youth, because that's where my passion is. And then New Orleans, I will continue to do it. You know, when you've almost lost something, which we almost lost our city, and almost lost our university, you take tremendous pride and you say, I'm going to make a difference and I'm going to stay with it. We all made decisions after Katrina. Do we stay or do we go? A lot of people left. By the way, that population of the city today, I told you was about 480,000. Before Katrina, it's 375,000. 100,000 people never returned. And they found a better life someplace else. But those who stayed really got committed to it. So the hope of our cities and our urban areas really rests with you. And if you don't have the will and you don't have the desire, don't look for somebody else next to you to do it. It has to be you. And what you're capable of doing, you have no idea. But I saw what good people, ordinary people, are doing extraordinary things in New Orleans. And what I want is for Cleveland to continue the progression it's in. So we can also say about Cleveland, it's a model urban area that other urban areas around America should be studying about how to do these things. Thank you very much.
So, are we on here? Please, if you have questions, come up to the microphone.
Could they just stand up and yell loud?
Or you could stand up and yell out, and I'm sure Scott will gladly.
That will save them the trouble.
And I'm sure Scott will repeat the question. So please, Scott, if you could just repeat the question.
Sure, I will, please. Yes, sir.
Scott, can you tell me what you did at Tulane to get the kids back into school? I know that you had some. I remember the story, but it's so long ago now.
Yeah.
That you had some relationships with other universities and colleges.
Yeah, what happened was in the fall of '05, we was closed down. By the way, the first American university of our size and stature to close down since the Civil War. Think about that. Everybody wrote us off. They said we would never come back. And we're, even 10 years later, still got remnants of Katrina in us. But here's what we did. About 2 weeks after the storm, I got on the phone one day with the heads of the higher education authorities in America. There's about 7 or 8 of them. And I said, listen, our kids don't have any place to go to school. And same for Xavier University, Loyola University, not just Tulane. There's some things you could do to help us? And I said, first of all, would you put a cry out to all the colleges and universities to accept our students? Let them come in the fall of '05 so they can continue their education. The second thing is, don't charge them tuition. Let them come for free. But we're going to charge them tuition. So they will pay it to Tulane, but they'll go to your school. And in return for that, we will give those students almost blanket credit for the courses they take at your school, no matter where it is. And then we sweeten that by saying we'll also let them take a semester for free at Tulane when they come back. And the third thing was you cannot let them transfer in January of '06. You have to say no transfers. If they don't want to come back to Tulane, make them sit out then for a semester. Because if you let them transfer, they'll never come back. So I was roundly criticized around the tuition one. You know, how did you have the chutzpah to charge kids and they weren't even there? And listen, it was simple. We wouldn't have survived if we hadn't had that tuition revenue. Because one of the decisions we made in the fall of '05 was we paid every single faculty member and staff every month for 5 months at a tune of $40 million a month, and we had no money. So we had to get money someplace, and we did it, but we struck this bargain. We'll take your credits, no questions asked, as long as you pass the course, and we'll give you a free semester. It turned out to have been a good decision. So that's what we did. Our first projections were that 50% of the students would return, the undergraduates. Ultimately, 87% came back. much higher than we anticipated. The real problem was the next fall. Normally we have an entering class of 1,600, 823 came up that fall. Now, you know that 823 is then with you for 4 years. So now you're digging yourself out of a hole for 4 years, because the year thereafter, it didn't go back to 1,600, it went to 1,100. Now we have another 3 years. It finally took us about 4 years or 5 years to get to the 1,600. Interestingly, by the time we got that, I think it was 2008 or 9, I may not have the exact years. That year, we got more applications to Tulane than any other private university in America. 44,000 applications for 1,600 spots. As a matter of fact, it got so high, we added a bunch more essays to reduce the application pool. Seriously, because we had too many applications. So now we have it down to 32,000 or something, and it's steady at 32,000. But that's what we did. Yes?
An observation and a question.
Sure.
An observation would be, New Orleans had a trial by fire, and the people, I have to believe that the people who are in New Orleans now, most of them are there because they want to be there. They were all scattered, they could have stayed where they were.
Right.
If they were professionals, they could have, and many others, they could have gotten jobs where they were. And you've got something unique in big cities now in New Orleans.
Right.
The second question, the question I have is, in terms of the 100,000 population loss, what are the demographics? Was it across the board? Did he lose the poor, the wealthy, the in-between, all of the above?
Well, we lost a little bit of all the above, but the honest answer is we lost mostly black and poor. Because it was their homes that was flooded. They went someplace else. I just pray that they got jobs, got better education, they got better opportunities someplace. But most of all, their home, they had nothing to come back to, and they didn't have the resources. So we lost, by far, that's the largest population that we lost. The demographics has changed. For example, before the storm, we hardly had any Hispanic population in New Orleans. Now it's about 10%. The African-American population has decreased. The age of the population has gotten much younger, because this is a mecca now for young people. Because what's happened because of what we've gone through, it's created a culture of innovation and change, which just attracts young people like crazy. So the demographics had changed, but without a doubt, it's the poor, it's the black that primarily didn't come back. Yeah, Don?
Well, the mayor was such a hero, supposedly, after Katrina. What happened to that? Was he never a hero? Or?
He was never a hero. He was an idiot. So let me tell you the story of Ray Nagin. And I'm obviously being flip. When Ray first ran for mayor, we all got behind him. He was not a politician. He was a businessman, fairly successful. He just came across as a breath of fresh air. So we all got behind Ray. And his first 2 years in office, Ray did a very, very good job. This is before Katrina. About the third year, we began to wonder, well, does he have a game plan beyond what he did in the first 2 years? So does he have a vision? Does he have a game plan? And we began to wonder about the quality of his staff. So we were starting to ask him questions. When I say we, there's something like the Cleveland Tomorrow or the Business Council, we call it in New Orleans. And I said on that, Ray was starting to run for leader. We say, Ray, what about your staff? What's the quality of the staff? Are they strong? And we weren't getting the right kinds of answers. And then we said, well, what's your game plan? So if you have another 4 years, what's it like? And Ray had a hard time articulating on what that was. And then the storm happened. And when we realized he didn't have a strong staff, many of them are now in jail themselves. So up until that storm, for the most part, I would tell you, Ray was a good man. That's how I viewed him. A nice man, a good man, someone you'd enjoy. I wouldn't have agreed to be a commissioner of the city if I didn't believe in Ray Nagin. But we saw something different in him after the storm. And it really came to a head within 6 months after the storm, where he gave the famous Chocolate City speech. And the speech was that New Orleans was born to be a chocolate city. which means basically a black city. And he went so far as to say, and I may not have the exact quote, but the essence was, we can't let rich, white, uptown people take over the city. And he makes this speech. The day he made the speech, that afternoon he calls me on the phone. He said, did you hear about my Chocolate City speech? I said, yeah, Ray, I heard about it. He said, what did you think? I said, I don't know what you were thinking when you gave that speech. What were you trying to accomplish? All you did was create a race divide in our city, alienate people who were helping you. For what purpose? Why did you do this? So I said, you know, I think it was a very bad idea. And if there's anything you can do to repair that, I would. Well, it became very clear why he did it. He had to run for re-election. And he figured, I know where I'm going to get my votes this time around. I'm going to get it from the African American population. But that was the beginning of the end of Ray, in my view. He was erratic. He was talking about building casinos on Canal Street. We're thinking, what is he talking about? And he was just erratic. Yet he was the one that, you know, appointed the 17 commissioners, and forgetting me, the others were really good, and they did good work. But there was something different about him. And then it came out later on, you know, that quite honestly, he was taking money with his graft. So I don't know what happened. Actually, you know better than I, given your profession, what may have happened to him, but something happened to him. And to this day, he's in jail. I feel terrible about it because, you know, I liked him fundamentally, and I liked his wife, and I liked his children, but something happened to him after that storm. So I'm flip when I say that, but Ray caused a lot of problems. We could have had a faster recovery and a more effective recovery if he had not been mayor. He brought in a guy who was going to be the czar of rebuilding. And this guy comes in, and Ray says he's got a world-class reputation in rebuilding cities after disasters. Okay? What's his name? So we find out his name. What cities has he worked in? So he named the cities. I and a few of my friends, we called all those cities. No one had ever heard the guy. He lasted for a year and a half. He's still writing about his experience in New Orleans. And once again, just poor judgment on Ray's part. Unfortunately, the governor at the time, Kathleen Blanco, once again a very nice person, just could not deal with the situation. President Bush, who, you know, I had the opportunity to spend I don't know how many hours with President Bush, well-intentioned, very sincere, very kind, but there was no action beyond it, none whatsoever. Chertoff, who was head of Homeland Security, an empty suit in my view, and I wrote that in the book. And that's what we were dealing with all the time. Next, yes.
My daughter went to New Orleans as a high school student after Katrina, and she actually spent her freshman year at Tulane.
Good.
And it's an amazing college, and it's like no other city that I've ever been in America. And one of the things that impressed, obviously, is his education. Katrina gave everyone the chance to start with a clean slate. And you talk about the youth and hope and how you got that from your parents. And most of us get it at the local, quote-unquote,
right.
local family. And so as the best and the brightest of minds were developing an educational system for a generally poor population, poor minority population in New Orleans, what has been done, strategies to get the parents really involved, knowing that there are barriers that parents have, that it's not necessarily that they don't care,
Yeah.
it's not necessarily culture, there could be a lot of things. So what have you done?
So the question is how have we gotten the parents involved in public education where their sons and daughters are? First of all, you have to know that 92% of the public school students in New Orleans are in charter schools. 92%, which means virtually everybody. The second highest in America is Detroit. Third highest is is DC, and Detroit's about 42%. The reason I mention that is we then created a series of nonprofit organizations. When I say we, the general community. And Tulane actually created a physical incubator to house all of them. And we have one called New Schools for New Orleans. And what New Schools for New Orleans is, it just focuses on all the things charter schools need to do to be successful. And one of the biggest things was parent engagement. So what they do is they work with the charter schools and the parents about what does it mean to be engaged in the school. What is your responsibility? How should you be treating your children when you come home? So we've taken on the notion of parent engagement as this is a group who wants to do all the right things, but doesn't necessarily know what to do and how to do it. So it's been massive education.
And I would just ask, are there any kind of metrics that are developed to measure how successful that is?
I would say none that are terribly sophisticated, other than, we know the number of parents that are involved in the schools. We know the nature of their involvement, but we don't have enough longitudinal data to really draw any particular conclusions, but we will over time.
I'm interested in, since 92% of the children in charter schools, and you mentioned that the unions are no longer here, what is the new salary of teachers now versus what it was before?
I don't know the specific numbers other than to say it's significantly higher.
Higher?
Oh yeah. We have principals that make over $200,000 a year.
Okay, but teachers?
Teachers,
Charter schools, I don't
yeah.
believe them, they make garbage money, they're eligible for social services.
yeah,
Is that-
I was surprised. I learned that that's not the case in New Orleans. That's not the case in New Orleans. And the reason, I'll tell you why it's not the case, because first of all, charter schools are talked about too much. Charter schools are not going to guarantee success or failure at all. They're simply a means to an end. The only way charter schools really work is if you have superior talent.
Right.
And that means you have to invest in human capital, and that's the teachers and the principals. So what our decision was, we're going to invest in human capital, teachers and principals, and development for them over time. Otherwise, the charter school will be a failure. It's that simple. Now, we started out, to be very honest with you, with a lot of Teach for America students. As a matter of fact, we were the second largest city in the United States with Teach for America core people. And as you know, that had some successes and it had some failures. But that's now changing over time. But we invest an awful lot. So that New Schools for New Orleans does a lot with teacher development. We have organizations like Relay, which is now, developing master teachers. So we have all kinds of nonprofits, locally and nationally, who are in New Orleans that are working on sort of helping to attract and retain teachers. Yes?
I'm curious about the relationship between Houston and New Orleans, and it's about a big partnership in bringing that. And I know we visited when we were down there, synagogue in the upper, conservative synagogue in the upper area, that got a lot of problems, and they sort of packed up. And so Houston gave a lot of their effort and everything. Was somebody responsible for that relationship because there were other cities around?
The governor of Texas and the mayor of Houston were very, very welcoming, especially the mayor of Houston. And so there were a lot of us from New Orleans who either made temporary or permanent residence in Houston. It ultimately caused some friction in Houston because some of the criminals went over to Houston from New Orleans and caused problems there. So, but Houston really opened, and I give the credit primarily to the mayor and the civic leaders in Houston as making it welcoming. Now, even at the state level, I think they were very good with our students. So a lot of our students went to University of Texas or Texas A&M, and they passed legislation to be able to waive tuition, and in some cases just lowered. They did it instantaneously, so not just our kids, but any kids from Louisiana who were affected could come. So in my view, Texas really reached out and was a big help, in Houston in particular. And a lot of the displaced people are in Houston. I mean, they're mostly in the South, but I suspect the largest portion is in Houston, Texas.
Did a lot stay in Houston?
Yeah.
So you lost a lot of people because of that.
Yep. Yes, sir.
So one of the most radical changes, I think, pre and post Katrina was with law enforcement, and maybe you could.
Yeah. Well, we haven't broken the code on this one yet. So what happened after Katrina, first of all, violent crime went way down. So everybody was getting very excited, but what happens, all the criminals were in Houston. And there was no population, so who was there to rob, right? So, you know, everybody got euphoric. Oh my God, it's really safe around. Of course it's safe, there's nobody here. And then what happened, it began to build up again. And there were two characteristics to the crime. The vast majority was not random. It was people who knew one another committing crimes. And the other is the vast majority of the crimes were happening in parts of the city that had not been really repopulated. So about, and I may, once again, I lose a little track of the years, but probably 3-4 years ago, it was really very high. Now I give Mayor Landrieu credit. He brought in the Justice Department to come in and do a total review of what was going on with the criminal justice system, everything. And they put in a tremendous amount of resources and time and effort to mitigate violent crime in New Orleans. The last 2 years, we've seen a dramatic decrease. But as I've told the mayor, once again, what causes is the vast majority of violent crime in a city is from that group called disconnected youth I told you about. That's where the crime is. Why? They're hopeless. They have nothing else to do. You know, some of the most entrepreneurial kids I've ever met are the disconnected youth, most of whom are drug dealers. Do you have any idea, if you're 15 years old, how entrepreneurial you have to be a successful drug dealer? You have to be very, very clever. The question is, how do we take that cleverness and put it for good rather than selling drugs? But that's where that crime's coming from. So the mayor can tell you there are 800 kids, and he knows who they are, that probably commit 60% of the violent crimes in New Orleans. They're really focusing on that group. So they're doing a lot more than they've ever done before to mitigate violent crime, and we're starting to see the results now. There was a question, yes, back over here, now come here.
What would you recommend to improve K-12 education?
What would I recommend to improve K through 12? Well, I have to say, I am a big proponent of autonomous schools. Now notice I'm not using charter schools, autonomous schools. And what I mean by that is pushing decision-making down to the local level, to the principals and the teachers in the school, because they know best who their kids are and what those kids need. So I believe in autonomous schools, so more of that. I believe in taking more of the dollars that we allocate and not using it for central administration, but putting it at the school level. So look at how much of each dollar is being focused on supporting some bloated central system versus being put down in the school. That's the second thing. The third thing is massive investment in human capital. I've never met a teacher who didn't want to be good. To be very honest, maybe some of you have. I haven't met those. The question is, do they have the tools? Do they have the toolkit to be good? And are they appropriate? So we've got to support them. So I think investment in teacher development is very, very important. And that's the third thing I would do. So those are at least 3 things that I would do in the schools. And I would also, we made a mistake in New Orleans initially, and I take total responsibility. We defined success as making every kid college ready. That was a huge mistake. What we should have said, and we've changed it, college or career ready. And also invest very heavily in vocation and technical schools. Because let's face it, not everybody wants to go to college, nor should they, but we need more plumbers, electricians, and we should honor them, reward them, and give them opportunities. and I'd invest a lot more in that. So there are more pathways than just the traditional school, you know, that's really focused on turning kids out to go to college. Those are just some things I would do here. Yes?
What has been the net effect, loss or retention of senior research scientists at the university and the medical school?
You know, I haven't seen any dramatic. After the storm, we lost a couple. That, when I say a couple, that is what I would consider highly productive people that we didn't want to lose. We lost 2 or 3, one of which was a Nobel Prize recipient. And we've seen research dollars go up ever since. And we've been able to attract young scientists there, and occasionally we'll do cluster hires where we've been able to do it. So I would say there's been no appreciable decline, and in many ways, if you measured by research dollars, it's actually gone up and gone up at a pretty good rate. We were worried about that, but I'll tell you what helped us is when we paid everybody for 5 months, the loyalty those people have at Tulane, you've never seen anything like it. They would lay down on the railroad tracks for that institution because they remember at their greatest time of need, they got paid. And they remember it, and that affected everybody. Now, the other thing we had to do after Katrina, especially for the researchers, since I was spending money I didn't have anyway, I figured, what's the limit? You might as well do whatever. So we stood up a $20 million research fund, discretionary research fund, $20 million. And we seeded faculty to get, you know, to open their labs again, to get their equipment, to get back on the track. And then we did another tranche. So we invested tens of millions of dollars to help them, you know, rebuild their labs and do everything else. And that worked. That strategy really was if we had a lot more money, I'd do it I would have done it every year, quite honestly. But we did it for a couple of years. Harry?
Yeah, out of the money that you were spending or that you needed, how much came from federal, from city? Was any of it from insurance?
We wound up recuperating about, don't hold me to the exact number, but about 250, 275 from insurance out of a possible 500 and 550. The insurance companies, with 1 or 2 exceptions, were terrible, absolutely terrible. So we were in a lawsuit with every one of them, with the exception of one who was, we had a $75 million insurance policy with them. I don't mind telling you, it was Zurich. The CEO himself flew to Tulane in New Orleans and gave me the check. No questions asked. That, trust me, nobody else did that. So that was one. The second thing was FEMA. Now, I have the lowest regard for FEMA of any organization I've ever seen in the atmosphere. So to date, we've recovered about $100 million from FEMA. And they still owe us about $30 million. But what happens then with FEMA is, after so many years, the Office of the Inspector General of Homeland Security comes in and they audit everything they gave you, and then they want it all back. Because they say, well, they actually didn't follow the rules back then in Katrina, and you owe everything back. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not a lot. So we have been in dispute with the Department of Homeland Security, and I should say the Office of the Inspector General. I want to be very careful here, which is different from FEMA. We have been in dispute for 3 years now because they want money back, and when we say no. And it's been 3 years. We've probably spent $3 or $4 million on legal fees. Can you imagine this? Just trying to keep money that was given to us that FEMA approved years ago. The other source was there were some government grants that came through. There was some philanthropy. We got some very significant gifts from the Middle East. They were given, no strings attached. It came and there were literally no strings attached to it. But I would also say we still have $100 million of debt on our balance sheet that is still attributable to Katrina that we've never been able to pay off, probably $100 million. Yes?
Sort of following up on that, Scott, how did the alumni respond?
Fascinating. They fell into two camps, believe it or not. One camp is, what can we do? We'll write checks, we'll do anything in the world. The other is, you're toast. What's the point of giving you any more money? They fell into two camps. I never believed that alumni would just write you off and just say, what's the point here? And they were a minority. So a lot of alumni stepped forward and did good things for us. Some sat on the sidelines and waited a few years and then jumped in. But then there was a group that didn't. Now, I also have to say, we made some unbelievable controversial decisions about the university. We restructured the university after Katrina. We had to because of the reduction in the number of students, we were projected to lose about $100 million a year if we didn't restructure. So we did what most people back then labeled it as the largest restructuring of an American university that they'd ever seen. And we took out $75 million out of the budget in 5 months. We terminated tenured faculty. We closed down departments. We reorganized schools. We did everything. The AAUP, censured the administration. We were in, and they're right up there in the book with me with FEMA. And this is how absolutely insensitive that group is. They come and they hold their hearings about whether to censure us. And by the way, all the universities were censured, not just Tulane. What date? August 29th the following year, the anniversary date. They come to New Orleans to do their field work. And then they censured all of us. We didn't give a damn. I mean, we said, fine, we'll stay on the censure list forever. And I would tell all of you, in our academics, it made absolutely no difference in our life. There was this great threat that faculty were going to leave in droves. Nobody left. Faculty weren't going to come. Nobody ever said they're not coming because most didn't even know what the AUP was. So we went through a lot of stuff. The reason I mention that in itself disenfranchised some alumni. And I always said to the university, don't worry, when I retire, they'll come back, but I have a greater hypothesis. And I don't know if they do it at Case Western. Those that complain the most give the least to the university. So we used to, when they would write these ugly letters, I would give it to development and tell me what their lifetime giving record is. And it was unbelievably low. And you just say to yourself, well, what's going on here? And occasionally you get a big donor who does it. And so, you develop a thick skin. I mean, my kids, it was funny afterwards. They'd say, Dad, do you have any idea what people are writing about you on the web? And I said, I can only imagine. Do you want us to read it to you? I said, no, I don't want you to read it to me. What's the point of reading it? And people can be unbelievably cruel, and you have to have a thick skin to do it. I think that's where my Jersey background was helpful to me. Yes, sir.
To that point,
okay.
I came here in '97 from Chicago and joined Weatherhead, and I blinked and you were gone.
See, that's why I had to leave.
well, that's kind of where I'm going. And we blinked again and you were at Tulane. We blinked again and there was Katrina. Have you ever had a sense of destiny?
That's a very interesting. The answer is yes. Believe it or not, this sounds crazy. It really does. I remember when I was thinking about taking the job. I had spent, virtually my entire career at Case Western, loved it. The university treated me very well. And I had been offered 2 presidencies in the 1990s and turned them down and decided I didn't want to be a university president. And when the Tulane job came open, the only reason I interviewed for it, little known fact, Mrs. Weatherhead of the Weatherhead School graduated from Newcomb College at Tulane. So she said, would you interview for the job? Just do me a favor. So I figured, I'll go interview because they're not going to pick me because I'm a business school dean, so I'm a Philistine. And, it's an AAU school, and they just don't pick business school deans. And they still have never. Not just Tulane, any AAU school doesn't. I could never figure that out, but so I went down and I interviewed. I was one of 10 people. And I said to my wife, don't worry, it's not going to happen. And what they're going to do, they're going to narrow the 10 down to 5. And if I happen to be in that 5, I'll bow out. Well, they did something very unusual. They narrowed the 10 to 2. And the other one was, at that time, the provost at the University of Pennsylvania. Very distinguished guy. Now, I am one thing of all others, unbelievably competitive. So I said, okay, I'm a guy from Case Western Reserve, business school dean, and this guy has got a pristine resume. He's provost. Let's see what happens. And I remember, going to arts and sciences, because back then, it wasn't secret. You had to go make the rounds of everybody. So I'm sitting in arts and sciences, and I see them all sitting out there. And the first person says, you speak funny. I said, what are you talking about? It's the way you talk, it's sort of funny. So I said, what do you mean? I don't understand. So, it's sort of because I'm direct, that's my jersey, I come from a business school background. I said, this may come as a surprise to me, but you actually sound pretty funny to me. And then they raised some question about, well, geez, how would you know what it's like, to be an academic, something like that. And I said, wait a minute. I've been at Case Western Reserve for 23 years. It's one of the finest research universities. And somehow I creeped through that system and became a full professor. Then I went off to University of Virginia for a little bit and came back. And I said, so, my guess is, I know what it's about. Now, interesting enough, we had a very frank conversation, and I heard at the end that arts and sciences supported me. I later found out the other guy was so bad they didn't have an alternative. So, but I really believe it was destiny. I was born to be, my wife believes it. She said, that place was made for you. And I like places, and Case Western is always resembled in many ways. What Case does is, Case boxes above its weight class. Given its resources, which are pretty sparse given the competition. So they're competing with schools like, maybe there's not a direct, but the Vanderbilts, the Emorys, the Washington universities, all of which have endowments 3 to 4 times the size of Case Western. And yet they compete head to head. That takes an unbelievable amount of fortitude to be able to do that. If we had a $5 billion endowment, or Case had a $5 billion endowment, if you can't be successful, you should be fired. The ones that are successful are the Barbara who come, don't have a big endowment, don't have a lot of resources they control, and they find a way to be successful. That's the kind of school, that I was destined to be at, and I learned how to do it at Case Western Reserve University because that was the environment I grew up in. We were very decentralized. Listen, the Weatherhead School benefited for that system. I mean, we were able to grow and do very, very well during that time period because of the system at Case. And that is the system that, defines how, when I went to Tulane, I used to run it the same thing. I'll tell you one more story, then we'll end. So my first meeting at Tulane, all the deans were in the room. And they said, and I had been a dean for 14 years at Case Western. And they said to me, what's the biggest difference between being a dean and being the president? I said, the first difference is every trick you may think about doing, I have done. So there is no trick you can pull, financially or otherwise, that I myself didn't do because, I used to drive President Pitta crazy. And Kirk is laughing, we know, but we do that. And I said, the other big difference is when I was sitting in your seat, I used to think the president was a jerk, and now I am the jerk. And that started off with a good thing, so I've had a great relationship with the deans over the years. But it is interesting, I came to realize the preparation at Case Western Reserve that was highly decentralized, so if you were dean, you really had to work hard in your school, in all ways. And fortunately, the Weatherhead School back then, I don't know if it's still the case, we had a lot of relationships with the med school, with a lot of other parts of the university, so I got exposed to a lot of people. Turned out that was good preparation. So yes, I absolutely think it was destiny that I was there. And to a certain degree, I feel like coming back to Case Western Reserve University, even though it's in the form of a trustee, having that linkage again is all part of the story for me, part of the narrative that makes me feel good, that I can come back to the institution and try to contribute in some small way to them for all the things they did for me. Thank you very much, everybody.